knowledge of migration. My personal migration was privilege, his was necessity, but that necessity created a lot of trauma, which I've only started to realise. And even though we didn't really have time to talk on it, it's also shaped my identity as well in terms of how I would identify myself. And that has been shaped by me travelling and moving and becoming a little bit wiser, in essence.
Omar, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, I'll see you in a little bit. I'm going to switch our attention to Gaia as she's with us. See you soon, Omar. Gaia, good evening. Welcome to Rebel Book Club.
Hi.
Great to see you. Great to have you with us. I know you're busy and it's bank holiday, so we're really grateful. I'm recording this for those that aren't with us today. And as you might have heard from Omar, if you could switch your mic off, you sound like you're in a busy spot somewhere in Manchester. Thank you. We're recording this for those who aren't with us this evening. And we've just been discussing, Gaia, I guess, as you heard from Omar there, like where in our personal history migration has played a part, whether forced or out of choice. And as Omar, like many people, as you know, he was referring to the partition in India and how that, and he's just rediscovering that history and learning about it by reading books like Move and of course Nomad Century. So this is real and personal, right? As well as big and all these trends that are shaping our new world that you talk about. And I guess I wanted to start briefly with like where your motivation, your personal motivation was to dive into this particular topic out of all your anthropological interests and experience. Why was the future of human movement and migration the thing that you wanted to invest so much time in over the last few years?
Yeah, so I came to it really because I'd been in my travels around the world looking at our changed environment and the way our environment's changing and how that's changing where people live and how they live and all of that. I realized there was already an enormous amount of climate migration underway, which wasn't being talked about. And I realized that, places were already becoming unlivable. And we weren't hearing about that. But when you look at the climate models, it's very clear that that is only going to increase. And there was no plan in place. There's no conversation really happening about this. And in fact, by contrast, the narrative around climate change and climate adaptation was, we were starting to see an increase in climate denial again rising, and the narrative around migration was very hostile, not at all pragmatic, not realistic, and really unhelpful. And so I wrote the book out of frustration, really, to try and address some of these things and bring a much more realistic and solution focused look to what we could do if we start moving ahead with really thinking about these issues properly
and making a plan. And it seems to me from when I read it last year, and it just like and I know others who read it at the time in our community, it just suddenly like stood out as oh wow, this is such a fresh and important and vital perspective that we haven't really heard, even those of us who are curious about these kind of things. We've only heard anecdotal or data-driven stories. We haven't heard the full story. Well, how's it, and the thing that was exciting, certainly when I read Nomad Century, was like, oh, this is actually mass human movement and forced migration because of climate could be a big part of the potential solution, which seems at such odds to the story we're told, through mainstream media in much of the world. How has it been releasing this particular book into the world? What's the reaction been like? Because you've had a lot of attention, at least from where I'm sitting, for it. How's that been? Has it been exciting and supportive, or has it been quite a lot of conflict?
It's been mixed, actually. I mean, as I said, the narrative generally is very negative. And it's very hostile. It's weirdly focused on security issues, even though migrants don't really pose a security threat. We've seen the sort of a populist nationalistic in a lot of ways government in the UK, but also driven by Brexit and border control and all of this. We've also seen across Europe this very frightening rise of the radical right, of the far right, of populist governments again. There's like 5 nations that have got basically far right leadership in the EU, which is shocking. We've got elections coming up. So there has been a lot of interest actually from EU countries who are grappling with this, who are grappling with the climate crisis and with migration, to support that, I think. So I've had a lot of positive engagement, but I've also had a lot of hostility. I've had a lot of hate emails, and on social media, quite a lot of nastiness, and a lot of ignorance as well about these subjects, which is quite frustrating because, human mobility is completely natural and has been with us throughout our history. So it's not something completely new. And for some reason, these very tired and, untrue tropes and myths around migration are really clinging at the moment and becoming very dominant. So people are they just don't see the bigger picture. And so that's something I wanted to do. And also, people are scared of change, and they see climate policies, doing something about the huge threats that we actually do face. We actually do face huge security threats, not from people, but from our environment. And the way to address those, through climate action, which increase our security, and through more inclusive states, also cooperation between nations and within nations, actually increases our security and our ability to deal with all of these things. So the solutions really are the things, I feel that there's a lot of misplaced fear, which is being, of course, stoked up by nationalists and the far right at the moment.
And when you get to, I'm sure you don't indulge trolls and people who are attacking you, but if and when you feel like you have the energy to have conversations with people who are denying or dismissing or pushing back, does it give you a sense that at the root of it, it's a fear of losing control, or a change happening in their life, or losing some kind of power? Is that really what?
Yeah, I mean, people are very afraid of change, whatever it is, because it's unknown, because you don't know what's happening, and they think that the unknown, they think it's more likely to be worse. And this is particularly something as people get older. And we're living at a time when many economies are either stagnating or not growing very fast, where there is insecurity because there aren't enough houses, for example. So young people are worried that they won't be able to afford a new home, where there are threats of AI. There are really high price hikes in food, a lot of that driven by climate change. Energy, again, fossil fuel infrastructure driving a lot of that. And when people are, migrant numbers are increasing from our neighbors, like when Russia invaded Ukraine, and they're afraid of what that means. They think they're going to be more insecure, that there's going to be a loss to, well, it depends where you are. I've just come back from Poland, and there's a big fear of that, that lots of Muslims will come and they'll lose their Catholic identity. Or there's a fear that their language will go. I mean, it's all sorts of things that are, if you break it down and analyze it, it's that, it's not really based on anything, because that hasn't ever happened, And the reason for a lot of these problems is also because of labor shortages, because we're not having enough babies to support that aging populations, and people are emigrating. Poland, for example, is losing enormous numbers of people through emigration, and immigration would actually boost the economy and provide more jobs and more, particularly in, for example, healthcare or construction, and a lot of these areas where there are shortages. So, and in agriculture, which would actually drive down food prices. So, what has been missing is the alternative narrative, the positive narrative about immigration and all the positives they bring to the economy, to the society, to culture, to cities. And that is the same for the climate opportunity. Decarbonisation is a huge, huge opportunity to create a much cleaner, better, fairer, cheaper world with a much more reliable and secure energy system, which isn't vulnerable to a foreign power switching off their gas or oil or whatever. Because it's much more stable. You can produce it at home in your own country or through networks, so that if one goes down, there are plenty of others. So, these are actually really positive things that would happen. A lot of these energy changes, and the same with the food systems, which are only at the very beginning of even talking about. But we haven't had that. I don't think that leaders have been honest or open or progressive enough in really explaining what it means in a positive way, because these are very progressive moves. There's a lot of fear over the costs of all of this, but the costs of not doing it are so much higher. And
that does require a little bit of thinking beyond the next profit cycle, doesn't it, or the quarterly report?
Not necessarily. Like when it's described, how much will it cost to build wind power turbines or whatever, that is not compared to the cost of importing fossil fuels at all, which is already really high. And if you factor in the subsidies, if you factor in all of the other costs that come with it, the health costs and the other environmental damage and everything, it's a no-brainer economically. Yeah. But also it's good in terms of geopolitical security, and it's good in terms of in every way, it's a much
It reminds me a lot of what you're talking about, Gaia, reminds me of that classic cartoon of that. It's like a UN meeting, and there's a list on the board of on the slide of all the things that will happen if we start to respond to the climate crisis, which is like the list that you've just gone through, like cheap, clean energy, healthier, less polluted cities, more affordable healthcare, blah, blah, blah. It's like a list of amazing positives for humanity. And it's like, but what if it's a hoax? Like, well, we just got all of this.
Exactly. And it's just not sold like that. And it's the same with food. Our food system is broken. Farming is really insecure. It's filthy. It pollutes the water supply. It pollutes the soils. We have this biodiversity crisis, all of this. And yet, if you look at the way that, say, climate protesters are treated in Europe compared to how protesting farmers are treated, there's a stark contrast. They're completely, the government just rolls over the moment anyone appears on a tractor, but we need to make these changes. So, someone's going to have to actually, we're legally obliged to meet net zero targets. So when it's impossible to do it without reforming the farming system. So every time you delay it and go, okay, then we won't, that's not a solution.
Yeah, you're shooting yourself in the foot again. So I want to, with the short time we've got, talk about some of these solutions, which presumably, obviously, the election here in the UK and the other elections that are happening around the world that affect people in our community, it's making sure the right people get into government. I heard Ed Miliband talk the other day in person about the the energy plan, and he may be starting to deliver that in a few weeks' time, which potentially is really exciting on this topic. Members, by the way, if you want to, you've got a few minutes. If you want to ask Gaia a question directly, either jump in on video or write down below, and we'll try and squeeze it in. So on these solutions outside of voting for change, what are the areas where you think, a community of really sort of, professionals but curious and concerned citizens can do? What are the areas where we can start to participate in these solutions?
Well, I mean, on energy, you could look to your own home when you need to change your boiler, go for a heat pump. I mean, there's lots of energy solutions. But I mean, if you have money, look at where you're investing it. If you've got a pension, make sure it's not invested in fossil fuels, for example. I mean, that's financially risky, but it's also, environmentally not a great idea. So I'd have a look at that. Eat more plants. I mean, basically, it comes down to voting and campaigning on these issues. Send letters to your MP, make it clear that this is important to you. A lot of cities are really progressive, and they've already started moving from car-centric spaces back to sort of, I mean, they're still car-centric, but they are prioritizing other users, pedestrians, cyclists, that sort of thing, and that's immediately cleans the air and gives humans ownership rather than them being just roads.
Sure. So that's the kind of climate action plan at home. And Elaine's firing a chunky question your way. Here we go. So are we at risk, Guy, of repeating the Windrush generation, the impact of that in terms of needing skills and then marginalizing the people who came to help? What's your thought on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, we need to do better than that. We need much more inclusive policies where people come and they become citizens and they're treated as citizens. They feel like citizens because they are. We need to expand our idea of what it means to be a citizen. And I think in some places we're a lot better than in other places. Cities generally are a lot better than this. But, over the coming decades, it's not just going to be cities that expands. It's going to be towns that are more homogenized, expanding and becoming cities.
Yeah, in Scotland, in Scandinavia, and these.
Yeah, and that's kind of where the problem is a lot more, because the fear of other is much greater when you don't actually encounter migrants. People tend to have more of a fear of them, and so they have they're much more hostile. If you look across the world, really, at attitudes to immigration, the most hostility comes from the people who don't actually meet immigrants and won't ever meet immigrants because immigrants don't go there, and that's the problem, really. We need much more inclusive policies, and it comes from leadership. When we have leaders spouting really hostile, negative things about immigrants, comparing immigrants to terrorists or talking about invasions or calling people illegals, all of that sort of thing, it dehumanizes them. And it's very easy, once someone's been dehumanized, to kind of, to think of them as other and treat them as other. So yeah, I think the problem starts right at the top. It really does.
And we must have read 3 or 4 books over the last few years around migration stories, and the most recent was Yusra Mardini, which was turned into that film called The Swimmers, where her and her sister they fell out. They basically pulled this boat across, and people survived, and they eventually got here, and she became part of the Olympic refugee team. Amazing story, an ambassador. All the way from Syria. So, and it seems to me that when we hear these stories combined with the kind of the fact-driven books like yours, the penny does drop emotionally and head and heart. So how do we get more of us to connect with these stories? Is it through Netflix series? I mean, obviously it's through political and business.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would obviously much prefer more of those things, but I really think it speaks to a big problem in leadership, a kind of vacancy, a lack of compassion. And we talk about, if you listen to there's elections happening in Europe next week, or is it the week after? But soon, anyway. I can't remember what the date is. Sorry, I'm really tired. And then obviously UK elections. So there's a lot of electioneering going on at the moment, and it's really dominated by, talk about being a security and strength and being strong and firm, and there is this lack of heart. And really, if you are going to be a leader, you need to pull people together with something more than fear, right? You need to pull people together with, this sort of on a joint project that they feel that they care about. And that goes beyond, slogans about stop the boats or whatever. It goes to, our shared humanity, recognition of that, and recognition that people are struggling. And how do we deal with that in a way that brings everyone along?
I think the last time I felt that watching a leader was the early Obama years. When he was campaigning, it felt like come on, and he obviously had a very powerful personal story.
Obama was very powerful with that. I would say Merkel to a certain extent. I mean, she's obviously made mistakes, but she did make that plea for compassion. Jacinda Ardern, again, was another leader who really kind of was able to bring people together in a way that you don't get enough in civic society. We have this, I don't know if it's like a sort of shyness or a sort of repulsion against this sort of positive emotive thing. We kind of leave it to, I don't know, religious leaders or whatever. And that's very problematic, not least because, we're increasingly secular, and like the church and all of that are embroiled in all kinds of like disgraceful.
So there's a leadership vacuum and opportunity.
We need that real kind of talk of values, of human values from in the civic space.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the biggest problems. It's left to religion or NGOs, and that's not, of course they're in the job of doing that, but we need our actual civic leaders to do that as well.
But that's where I think you, like people like yourself and Kate Rayworth and Carol Cadwallader, these kind of activist, academic communicators, you've got a lot of attention because you're doing that job, but with a backup, right? With evidence, well-researched evidence, and a story to go with it. So I think but obviously we've got to reach the millions and billions, haven't we? Just quickly before, I appreciate your time, and you're tired and everything. Two quick questions, one as quick as we can be. So Dan, who was talking about his own family's migration story with us earlier, what role does the media play in sharing a more balanced, fact-based view of immigration?
Well, yeah, I mean, we need more of that. I think the media has been led in many places. In Britain, we've actually got one of the better media systems, and even so, we've seen some very problematic, this kind of the dominant narrative of migrants being a problem and a security threat is kind of unchallenged. Like, that's where we are, and it's all down to sort of policies of how we deal with this big problem. It's never sort of seen as, a continuation of really where we are, and that it's, migrants aren't in and of themselves a problem. The problem is how we manage our societies to deal with that, because actually we need more people, because
and that's why it can be a solution. The climate upheaval crisis.
And I don't see that enough. I see, some people are doing better at it than others. Channel 4 News tends to be a bit better than a lot of the reporting that I've seen. But it's not, the baseline has shifted, and it's damaging.
And as we heard even from Den was telling us, he wrote this question earlier, that the village that his ancestors or his parents came from in rural India, that the average temperature there last week was 42 to 45 degrees in their community. And so these people are not going to be staying in these places for much longer if that's sustained.
Exactly. I mean, that's 2024.
Yeah.
We're already seeing temperatures in the high 40s. It was like the Philippines was in the 50s. People were just literally dropping dead on the street. We've had sort of heat waves that have persisted, that have stayed in places in really, really high temperatures, as well as these really violent storms, and it's only going to get worse. That's where we are now, and so we need to be realistic about 2040, 2060. Like, where are we headed?
Yeah, exactly. And then finally, guys, so in terms of hope and your optimism, where are you? What are you drawn to right now that's giving you that?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm hopeful of is we've finally got an election coming. So I'm very hopeful that that things will change. I think Keir Starmer is he's, first of all, he's a much kinder person, and he's actually committed to trying to make people's lives better rather than personally enriching himself or furthering his own career. It seems like, and that's a much better perspective to start from, public service. So that's what gives me hope right now.
Yeah. And for our American friends and others listening around the world, he's this boring kind of old prosecutor who's been part of civil society, who's going to hopefully be Prime Minister in 4 weeks in the UK and lead the change we need. Guy,
I don't think he's boring. I think he's much more interesting than Sunak.
I mean that in a good way, in a good way, in a kind of like, we get on and do the job
human
way.
rights barrister,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Gaia, thank you. Not just for giving up half an hour on your bank holiday evening, but also for your work, because we followed your work, and a lot of us have read your work, Adventures in the Anthropocene, and of course Nomad Century, and your other work. So thank you for your leadership in this space and for waking up a lot of people.
Well, thank you for inviting me and taking an interest in this. It is so, it's so important, because this is the world that that we are shaping right now. So thanks for talking about it. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gaia. Take care. We'll see you soon out there somewhere. So I'm going to give you guys, now you've listened to Gaia, a little challenge where you're going to do some migration scenarios. I'm going to edit it so it's a bit shorter, because we've now had a good chat with Gaia. So we'll just do this for 10 minutes and then come back and share some of your thoughts based on what you've heard from Gaia. And let's do this and see what happens. Okay, off we go.